I live in a quiet, suburban town, the kind of place where you know your neighbor's dogs by name. For the last decade, my life has been a careful balance of building my career in wealth management and caring for my grandparents, who raised me. Their home was my home, a sanctuary of warmth and unconditional love. But that sanctuary was built on a foundation I would soon have to defend from my own family. This is the story of how a quiet promise to my grandfather led me to create an ironclad legal fortress around their life's work, just in time to stop the wrecking ball my aunt was aiming at it. Before this story unfolds, I'd love to connect with you. Please let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is in your corner of the world. It's amazing to see how far these stories can travel. My grandfather, Arthur, was a man carved from oak. He was a builder, not just of the houses that lined our town's older streets, but of character. His hands, though gnarled with age and calloused from a lifetime of labor, were surprisingly gentle. He could fix a leaky faucet, build a bookshelf from scratch, and calm my childhood fears with a single reassuring pat on the back. My grandmother, Eleanor, was the heart of our home. She filled the space with the scent of baking bread, the sound of classical music drifting from an old radio, and the quiet wisdom of a woman who had seen the world change in more ways than I could imagine. They raised me after my parents passed away in a car accident when I was 5. They weren't just my guardians. They were my entire world. Their house was a testament to their life together, a sturdy 2-story colonial Arthur had built himself in the late 60s. Every floorboard that creaked, every window that rattled in the wind, was a part of my personal history. It was in that house I learned to read, with Grandma Eleanor's finger tracing the words in a book. It was in that backyard I learned to throw a baseball with Grandpa Arthur, his patience endless. They put me through college, celebrating my graduation with more pride than if they had earned the degree themselves. When I landed my first job as a wealth management associate, Grandpa Arthur had tears in his eyes. "You see, Eleanor," he'd said, his voice thick with emotion. "She's going to be the smart one, the one who manages the money, not just earns it." He had no idea how prophetic those words would become. As they entered their late 80s, the vibrant energy that had once filled the house began to fade. Grandma Eleanor's memory started to fray at the edges, and Grandpa Arthur's strong back began to stoop under the invisible weight of age. My life shifted. My career was important, but they were my priority. I arranged my work schedule to be home with them more, managing their appointments, their finances, and ensuring they were safe and comfortable. My Aunt Karen, their only daughter, lived 2 towns over. She'd call once a week, her conversations always brief and punctuated with sighs about how busy she was with her real estate showings, or how her husband, David, was stressed about his consulting business. Her visits were rare, usually reserved for holidays, where she'd sweep in, offer a perfunctory hug, and spend most of the time scrolling on her phone. One crisp autumn evening, about a year after my graduation, Grandpa Arthur called me into his study. The room was his sanctuary, paneled in dark wood and smelling of old books and pipe tobacco. He was sitting in his worn leather armchair, a shoebox filled with documents on the table beside him. "Amelia," he began, his voice softer than usual, "I need to talk to you about something important. Something your grandmother and I have been discussing." He gestured for me to sit. He explained that their health was declining faster than they let on. He knew he didn't have much time left. With a steady hand, he pushed the shoebox toward me. It contained the deed to the house, bank statements, investment portfolios, and life insurance policies. The total value of their estate was a little over $3 million, a sum built from a lifetime of hard work, frugal living, and shrewd investments. "This is everything, kiddo," he said, his gaze unwavering. "Your grandma and I, we've worked our whole lives for this. We want it to be for you. You were the one who was here. You are the one who has cared for us." I started to protest, to say it was their money, but he held up a hand. "No, you listen. We know our daughter. We love Karen, but she and David see things differently. They see money as something to be spent, to be shown off. We see it as security, as a legacy. He leaned forward, his expression turning serious. When we're gone, she's going to come looking for it. She will feel entitled to it, and she will run through it like a flash flood. The weight of his words settled in the quiet room. This wasn't just about money. It was about protecting his life's work, his legacy, and the very definition of security he had built for our family. I want you to be the executor of our will, he continued. But more than that, I want you to be smart. Your grandmother and I trust your judgment completely. We want you to make sure this legacy does good, for you and for others, in the way we taught you. He paused, taking a deep breath. So, here's my promise to you. Everything we have will be yours, and I need a promise from you in return. Promise me you'll protect it. Protect it from anyone who would waste it, even if it's your own aunt. I looked into his clear, honest eyes and saw the fear behind his strength, the fear of a parent who knows their child's flaws all too well. I promise, Grandpa, I whispered, my voice thick with emotion. I promise I'll protect it. That promise became a sacred pact, a silent vow that would guide every decision I made in the months to come. I didn't know it then, but I was being handed the keys to a fortress just before a siege was about to begin. Grandma Eleanor passed away peacefully in her sleep that winter. The loss was a quiet, hollow ache that settled deep in our bones. Grandpa Arthur was never the same. It was as if the light in his life had been extinguished, and he was left wandering in the twilight. He held on for another 6 months, his body growing frail, his stories of their youth becoming more frequent. I spent those final months by his side, reading to him, listening to his memories, and holding his hand. He passed away on a sunny morning in June, leaving the house feeling cavernously empty and silent. The grief was immense, a tidal wave that threatened to pull me under. But through the fog of sorrow, my promise to him remained, a single, unwavering point of light. The funeral was a somber affair. Friends and neighbors came to pay their respects, sharing stories of my grandparents' kindness and generosity. My Aunt Karen and Uncle David stood at the front of the receiving line, playing the part of the grieving daughter and son-in-law perfectly. Karen, dressed in expensive black silk, dabbed at her dry eyes with a tissue, while David stood beside her, his hand on her back, his expression a carefully crafted mask of solemnity. They accepted condolences with practiced grace, their voices hushed and mournful. To anyone watching, they were the picture of sorrow, but I could see the cracks in their performance. During the reception at the house, I overheard snippets of their conversations. While people shared fond memories of my grandparents in the living room, Karen and David were in the kitchen, their voices low. I stepped into the hallway, just out of sight. The appraiser should be able to come by next week, David was saying. We need to get a clear number on the house before we do anything else. No sense in underselling it. Karen shushed him, but not before I heard her reply. I know, David, I know. But we have to be delicate. Amelia is the executor. We can't just steamroll her. My blood ran cold. My grandparents had been gone for less than 48 hours, and they were already talking about selling their home, the home I grew up in, the home my grandfather built with his own 2 hands. They weren't mourning a loss. They were calculating a profit. Over the next few days, their true colors began to bleed through their carefully constructed masks of grief. The phone calls started. At first it was Karen, her voice dripping with fake concern. How are you holding up, sweetie? It must be so hard for you, all alone in that big house. The question was always followed by a casual, probing inquiry. Have you had a chance to look at the will yet? Your father was so private about his finances. I would give her vague, non-committal answers, telling her I was still grieving and hadn't looked at any paperwork. Her frustration was palpable, a sharp edge in her otherwise syrupy tone. Then came David. His approach was different, an attempt at a man-to-man, or in this case, man-to-niece, talk about practicalities. "Amelia, I know this is a tough time," he'd start, his voice oozing false sincerity. "But we need to be pragmatic. Estates can get complicated. There are taxes, legal fees. It's a lot to handle. Karen and I are here to help you navigate all of it." His help always involved him asking for account numbers, for the name of my grandparents' lawyer, for a copy of the will. He positioned himself as an experienced guide, ready to take the burden off my young shoulders. I knew he was trying to get his hands on the controls. The final straw came about a week after the funeral. I was in the study, sorting through boxes of old photos, when Karen and David let themselves in with a key they had from years ago. They didn't call first. They didn't knock. They just walked in, their expressions a bizarre mix of feigned sympathy and impatient entitlement. "Oh, sweetie, we didn't want to bother you," Karen said, placing a Tupperware container of what looked like store-bought lasagna on the kitchen counter. "We just thought we'd come by and see how you were doing." They followed me back into the study, their eyes scanning the room, lingering on the file cabinets and my grandfather's desk. "You know, Amelia," David began, picking up a silver letter opener from the desk and inspecting it. "Your grandparents wouldn't want you to be burdened by all this. This house, it's a lot of upkeep, and their investments need to be managed properly." Karen chimed in, her voice smooth as silk. "What your uncle is trying to say is that we think it would be best to liquidate the assets. Sell the house, cash in the stocks. It's the simplest way. We can split everything 3 ways. A third for me, a third for David, and a third for you. It's only fair." I stared at her, utterly speechless. 3 ways? The will clearly left everything to me, but her statement revealed everything. She wasn't just assuming she was a beneficiary. She was acting as if she were in charge, as if the estate were already hers to divide. The audacity was breathtaking. They stood in my grandfather's study, surrounded by the memories of the people they claimed to be mourning, and brazenly laid out their plan to dismantle his entire legacy for a quick payday. There was no sentiment, no respect, just a cold, hard hunger for money. The grief I felt was suddenly sharpened by a new emotion, a cold, clear-eyed anger. My promise to my grandfather echoed in my mind, no longer a quiet whisper, but a resounding command. They saw me as a young, grieving girl they could easily manipulate. They saw my grandparents' legacy as a pile of cash waiting to be claimed. They were wrong on both counts. As they left that day, I smiled politely and thanked them for the lasagna, which I later threw in the trash. The masks had not just slipped. They had been torn off, and I now saw the faces of the vultures I had promised to protect my grandfather's legacy from. The battle had begun. After that disastrous visit from Karen and David, the fog of grief began to lift, replaced by a chilling clarity. Their intentions were no longer a matter of suspicion. They were a declared agenda. They saw my grandparents' estate as their personal lottery win, and I was just a temporary obstacle. My promise to my grandfather felt heavier than ever, but it was also my shield and my sword. I knew I couldn't just follow the instructions in the will. I had to get ahead of them. I had to understand the full scope of their greed to effectively counter it. My work in wealth management had taught me one crucial lesson. The best way to predict future behavior is to understand past patterns. So, I started digging. My grandfather, for all his old-school charm, was a meticulous record keeper. His study was a time capsule of his financial life. He had filing cabinets filled with decades of bank statements, tax returns, and investment reports, all neatly labeled in his slanted, deliberate handwriting. I started with the most recent years, poring over bank statements and credit card bills. At first, everything seemed normal. Utility bills, grocery expenses, donations to their favorite charities. But as I went further back, about 5 years ago, a pattern began to emerge. It started with small things. A recurring monthly charge of $200 to a cable and internet package that seemed far too expensive for 2 seniors who only watched the evening news. I cross-referenced the account number and found it was registered not to my grandparents' address, but to Karen and David's. They had put their premium cable bill in my grandfather's name, letting him pay for it for years. It was a small, petty deception, but it was a starting point. It showed me they had no qualms about leeching off her parents. I kept digging, my anger simmering into a cold resolve. Next, I found a series of large cash withdrawals from my grandparents' checking account, all made from an ATM near Karen and David's home. The withdrawals were always just under the daily limit, small enough to not trigger an automatic fraud alert from the bank. But they added up. Over 2 years, it amounted to nearly $20,000. I could picture it perfectly. Karen borrowing her father's debit card for a grocery run and helping herself to a little extra each time. The most damning discovery came from a folder labeled Business Loan, David. Inside was a promissory note, signed 5 years prior. David had pitched my grandfather on a can't-miss business venture, a consulting firm he was starting. He had needed $50,000 for startup capital and had promised to pay it back, with interest, within 2 years. The folder contained the initial agreement, but there were no records of any repayments. Not a single one. I cross-referenced the bank statements for that period. The $50,000 had left my grandfather's account, but nothing had ever come back in. David had taken the money and simply never paid it back, likely assuming his folksy, charming father-in-law would eventually forget about it or be too kind to demand it. I sat back in my grandfather's leather chair, the pile of documents on the desk in front of me. It wasn't just 1 or 2 instances of poor judgment. It was a calculated long-term pattern of financial exploitation. They had been treating my grandparents as their personal ATM for years, taking advantage of their generosity and trust. The expensive vacations Karen posted about on social media, the new car David was driving every other year, the designer clothes she wore, I suddenly saw it all in a new light. It was all funded, at least in part, by the slow, steady draining of my grandparents' savings. My mind reeled back to conversations I'd had with my grandma before her memory started to fade. She would sometimes mention with a worried frown that Karen was having a tough time with money, or that David's business was slow to get off the ground. My grandparents, in their endless kindness, had likely seen it as helping their struggling daughter. They probably had no idea of the true scale of the deception. Karen and David hadn't just been greedy. They had been manipulative, preying on the love and empathy of their own parents. This discovery changed everything. My mission was no longer just about fulfilling the will as written. It was about rectifying years of hidden injustice. My promise to Grandpa Arthur wasn't just to protect what was left. It was to defend the very principles he lived by: honesty, hard work, and integrity. The money they had siphoned off was gone, and trying to legally claw it back would be a messy, protracted battle I likely wouldn't win. But I could ensure they never got another cent. I now had the evidence I needed, not for a courtroom, but for my own conscience. It solidified my resolve and gave me the moral authority to take decisive, preemptive action. The shoebox of documents my grandfather had given me was his last will and testament. This pile of incriminating evidence was theirs. They had written their own story of greed, and I was about to write the final chapter. My next call was to the one person I knew would understand: Robert Miller, my grandfather's oldest friend and retired financial advisor. The investigation phase was over. It was time to build a fortress. Armed with the sickening evidence of my aunt and uncle's financial predation, I knew my next steps had to be strategic and legally sound. This was beyond just securing an inheritance. It was a counterintelligence operation against an enemy that had been embedded in the family for years. I packed the files, the cable bills, the ATM withdrawal records, the unpaid promissory note, into a briefcase and drove to the home of Robert Miller. Robert had been my grandfather's financial advisor for 40 years, and his fishing buddy for even longer. A sharp, kind man with a no-nonsense demeanor, Robert had retired a few years back, but his mind was as sharp as ever. If anyone would understand the nuances of the situation, it was him. I found him in his meticulously organized study, surrounded by financial journals and photos of his grandchildren. I laid everything out on his large mahogany desk, walking him through my discoveries one by one. I explained the funeral conversation, the intrusive visit, and the pattern of financial abuse I had uncovered. Robert listened patiently, his expression growing more grim with each document I presented. He steepled his fingers, his eyes focused on the promissory note from David. When I finished, he was silent for a long moment, his gaze distant. "I'm not surprised. Amelia," he finally said, his voice low and tinged with anger. Arthur mentioned his concerns to me a few times over the years. He knew Karen was flighty with money, and he never trusted David. He called him a man with a weak handshake and a weaker moral compass. But Arthur was a proud man. He didn't want to believe his own daughter could be so deliberately deceitful. He always made excuses for her. Robert picked up the unpaid loan agreement. This $50,000 loan, I advised him against it. I told him if he was going to give David money, to consider it a gift, because he'd never see it again. Arthur insisted on making it a formal loan, I think to give David a sense of responsibility, a responsibility David clearly never felt. Robert's confirmation was a cold comfort. It meant my grandfather had seen the signs, even if he couldn't bring himself to fully accept them. His decision to entrust everything to me was not a sudden impulse. It was a final, desperate move to protect his legacy from a threat he knew all too well. Robert leaned back in his chair. So the will leaves everything to you and names you as executor. That's a strong position, but it's not foolproof. Karen can and likely will contest it. She'll claim you exerted undue influence over your grandfather in his final years. She'll paint you as the manipulative caregiver who swooped in and poisoned her father against his only daughter. It'll be ugly, expensive, and it will drag your grandparents' names through the mud. He was right. A court battle would be a nightmare. It would drain the estate's resources and tarnish the very memory I was trying to honor. So what do? I asked, feeling a fresh wave of anxiety. How do I honor my promise and avoid a war? Robert's eyes twinkled with a spark of the strategic mind that had made him such a successful advisor. You don't play defense, Amelia. You play offense. You don't just execute the will. You restructure the entire estate in a way that makes the will almost irrelevant. You take the assets and place them somewhere so secure, so legally untouchable, that by the time Karen and David come to challenge you, there's nothing left for them to fight over. He explained the concept of an irrevocable trust. Unlike a will, which goes through a public probate process and can be contested, a trust is a private legal entity. Once I, as the trustee, move the assets, the house, the stocks, the cash, into the trust, they would no longer be part of my grandparents' estate. They would be owned by the trust itself, governed by the precise rules I set forth within the trust document. You create the trust in the spirit of your grandparents' wishes, Robert explained. You can set up provisions for your own well-being, for charitable donations they cared about, for educational funds. You build a legal fortress. When Karen comes with her lawyers, you show them the will, and then you inform them that the estate is essentially empty, because all the assets were transferred to the Arthur and Eleanor Legacy Trust, prior to his passing. The beauty of the plan was its quiet, unassailable logic. It wasn't about hiding the money. It was about recategorizing it, protecting it under a different legal framework. Robert gave me the name of a top-tier estate lawyer, a woman named Ms. Albright, known for her bulletproof legal work. She's expensive, Robert warned, but she's the best. Consider it the first and most important investment you make on behalf of your grandparents. As I left Robert's house, I felt a renewed sense of purpose. He hadn't just given me legal advice. He had given me a battle plan. I wasn't just Amelia, the grieving granddaughter, anymore. I was the architect of my grandparents' legacy, and I was about to draw up the blueprints for a fortress. The dots were now fully connected. I understood the history of their greed, the immediate threat they posed, and the legal path forward. The next phase required precision, speed, and absolute discretion. Karen and David thought they were waiting for the reading of a will. They had no idea I was about to rewrite the entire book. The following Monday morning, I was sitting in the polished, intimidatingly quiet office of Ms. Albright. She was a woman in her late 50s with sharp eyes and an air of competence that was instantly reassuring. I laid out the entire story for her, just as I had for Robert, presenting the documents and my fears about my aunt's intentions. She listened without interruption, her expression unreadable. When I finished, she nodded slowly. "Mr. Miller was right to send you," she said, her voice crisp and professional. "An irrevocable trust is precisely the instrument we need. It's clean, it's private, and it's formidable. Your aunt can scream and shout all she wants, but legally, she won't have a leg to stand on." Over the next 3 weeks, Ms. Albright and I worked tirelessly to construct the Arthur and Eleanor Legacy Trust. It was the most intense and empowering project of my life. My background in wealth management was invaluable. I understood the mechanics of asset transfers, tax implications, and portfolio management. But Ms. Albright was the master architect, designing the legal structure that would make it all impenetrable. We started with the trust's mission statement, which I wrote myself. It wasn't a dry legal document. It was a declaration of my grandparents' values. It stated that the trust's purpose was to support causes they cherished, to provide for my future in a responsible manner, and to foster education and community building. We designed the trust with several key provisions. First, it named me as the primary trustee, giving me full control over the management of the assets. We also appointed a corporate co-trustee, a reputable bank, as a failsafe. This added a layer of legitimacy and ensured that if anything ever happened to me, the trust would continue to be managed professionally, preventing anyone else, namely Karen, from ever seizing control. Second, we outlined the distribution rules. The trust would provide me with a modest annual stipend, enough to live comfortably but not extravagantly. This was a deliberate choice. I wanted to show that my goal wasn't to enrich myself, but to preserve the capital. Any significant personal expenditure would require approval from the co-trustee, creating a system of checks and balances. The most crucial part was what we did with the bulk of the funds. We allocated a significant portion of the estate to create 2 charitable arms within the trust. One was a scholarship fund at the local community college for students pursuing careers in the building trades, a tribute to my grandfather. The other was a fund to support local arts and music programs in schools, honoring my grandmother's passion. We also included a discretionary clause, which gave me, as trustee, the power to make additional charitable gifts as I saw fit, ensuring the trust could adapt to future needs. This wasn't just about protecting the money from Karen. It was about transforming it from a static pile of wealth into a dynamic engine for good, exactly as my grandparents would have wanted. While Ms. Albright drafted the legal documents, I began the quiet and methodical process of transferring the assets. I started by liquidating the stock portfolio, a move that would have been necessary for any estate settlement, so it wouldn't raise suspicion. The cash was then moved into a new account opened in the name of the trust. The most emotional part was transferring the deed to the house. I had to go to the county clerk's office and sign the papers that officially made the trust the owner of my childhood home. As I signed my name, I felt a pang of sadness, but it was overshadowed by a profound sense of security. The house was no longer just a piece of property in an estate. It was now a protected historical site of my family's love. Throughout this entire process, Karen and David were blissfully unaware. They called me every few days, their questions about the will becoming more frequent and less patient. "Have you scheduled a meeting with the lawyer yet, Amelia?" Karen would ask, her voice tight with anticipation. "These things need to be handled quickly." I would put them off with polite excuses. "I'm still organizing the paperwork," I'd say. "The lawyer is waiting on some documents from the bank." I was feeding them just enough information to keep them from getting overly suspicious, while behind the scenes, I was dismantling the very prize they were waiting for. Each phone call felt like a countdown clock, and with each asset I successfully moved into the trust, I felt another wall of the fortress click into place. By the end of the 3rd week, it was done. The $3 million estate, the house, the investments, the savings, was now legally owned and controlled by the Arthur and Eleanor Legacy Trust. My grandparents' personal estate was now technically valued at less than $10,000, which was the sum in their checking account used for daily expenses. The fortress was built. The treasury was secured. All that was left was to wait for the vultures to arrive for the feast, only to find the gates barred and the cupboards bare. I called Karen and told her I had finally scheduled the meeting to discuss the will for the following Friday. The trap was set. The day of the meeting was overcast and gray, a fitting backdrop for the storm I knew was about to break. I chose to hold it in my grandfather's study. The room felt like my home turf, a place where I was surrounded by his strength and integrity. I had asked Robert Miller to be there, not in any official capacity, but as a silent witness and a source of moral support. He sat quietly in a chair by the window, his presence a calming anchor in the tense atmosphere. I sat behind my grandfather's large oak desk, a single manila folder in front of me. The folder contained a copy of the will and a 1-page summary of the trust. Karen and David arrived precisely on time, which was unusual for them. They were practically vibrating with anticipation. Karen was wearing a new, expensive-looking blazer, and David had a predatory smile plastered on his face. They looked less like grieving relatives, and more like game show contestants who were certain they were about to win the grand prize. "Amelia, darling," Karen said, breezing into the room. "So glad we can finally get this all sorted out." David clapped me on the shoulder, a gesture that was meant to be friendly, but felt possessive. "Ready to get down to business?" he asked, his eyes darting around the room as if he were already mentally appraising the furniture. They sat in the 2 chairs opposite the desk, leaning forward expectantly. "So," Karen began, unable to contain her impatience. "Did you bring the will? Let's just have a read, shall we?" I took a slow breath, my promise to my grandfather echoing in my ears. I pushed the folder across the desk toward them. "This is a copy of the will," I said, my voice calm and steady. "It's very straightforward. As Grandpa told me he would, he named me as the sole executor and the sole beneficiary of his entire estate." Karen snatched the will from the folder. Her eyes scanned the page, her smile faltering, then disappearing entirely as she read the key phrases. "I give, devise, and bequeath all the rest, residue, and remainder of my estate to my beloved granddaughter Amelia." Her face turned pale, then blotchy with rage. "What is this?" she hissed, throwing the papers onto the desk. "Sole beneficiary? That's impossible. I'm his daughter. He would never do that." David grabbed the will, his face darkening as he read it. "This is ridiculous," he snarled. He was an old, sick man. "You clearly manipulated him, Amelia. You got into his head when he was vulnerable. This will never hold up in court. We'll contest this. We'll prove you exerted undue influence." I let their outrage wash over me. I had expected this reaction, and I was ready for it. I remained perfectly still, my hands folded on the desk. "You are welcome to contest the will," I said evenly. "But it won't matter." Karen laughed, a short, ugly sound. "Oh, it will matter. Our lawyer will tear this apart." I held her gaze. "No, it won't matter because there is nothing for you to contest. The estate, for all intents and purposes, is empty." A confused silence fell over the room. David squinted at me. "What are you talking about? Empty? What about the house? The investments? Your grandfather's portfolio was worth millions." I reached into the folder and slid the second piece of paper across the desk. Before he passed, on his explicit instructions, and with his full blessing, I took steps to protect his legacy. All of his major assets, the house, the stocks, the savings, were transferred into a private, irrevocable legal entity. It's called the Arthur and Eleanor Legacy Trust. I watched as the color drained from their faces. I saw the dawning horror in their eyes as the implications of my words sank in. "A trust?" Karen whispered, her voice barely audible. I continued, my voice clear and unwavering. "The trust is now the legal owner of everything. The will only governs the few personal assets that remained in my grandfather's name at the time of his death, which amounts to his checking account, a few pieces of furniture, and his collection of old books. As the sole beneficiary, those things are mine. But the real wealth, the $3 million, is locked away." David slammed his fist on the desk. "You can't do that. That's illegal. We'll sue you. We'll sue the trust." I shook my head slowly. "You can't. The trust is a separate legal entity, and you are not named as beneficiaries. It was established to honor my grandparents' wishes. A large portion of the funds are being used to create a trade school scholarship in Grandpa's name and to fund arts programs in honor of Grandma. The rest is to be managed for my well-being and for future charitable endeavors." I leaned forward, my voice dropping. "It's all perfectly legal. I had one of the best estate lawyers in the state set it up. It's ironclad. The fight went out of them, replaced by a stunned, impotent fury. They finally understood. They had been completely and utterly outmaneuvered. There would be no lottery win, no house to sell, no inheritance to fund their lifestyle. There was nothing. Karen just stared at me, her mouth opening and closing silently, her face a mask of disbelief and hatred. David was sputtering, searching for a threat, an angle, but there was none. I had built a fortress, and they were on the outside looking at unbreakable walls. The day of reckoning had arrived, not with a loud courtroom battle, but in the quiet, dignified space of my grandfather's study with the simple, devastating truth. The immediate aftermath of the confrontation was an explosion of pure rage. Karen unleashed a torrent of insults, calling me a thief, a snake, and a disgrace to the family. David, for his part, resorted to empty legal threats, promising he would find a lawyer who would crush my little trust. I remained silent through it all, letting their anger burn itself out. There was nothing left to say. When their fury subsided into sputtering, defeated muttering, they stormed out of the house, slamming the door so hard that a picture frame on the wall rattled. The silence they left behind was profound and deeply satisfying. Robert Miller looked over at me from his chair by the window and gave a slow, approving nod. "Your grandfather would be very proud, Amelia," he said quietly. "Very proud indeed." In the weeks and months that followed, life settled into a new normal. As predicted, Karen and David consulted a lawyer. I received a blustering, threatening letter from their attorney, full of accusations and demands for a full accounting of the trust. My lawyer, Ms. Albright, responded with a calm, two-paragraph letter that essentially stated the trust was a private entity, my aunt and uncle were not beneficiaries, and any further communication would be viewed as harassment. We never heard from their lawyer again. The cost of a legal battle against a fortress like the one we had built was prohibitive, especially for a case with no chance of success. They had no choice but to give up. The family ties, already frayed, were severed completely. I received no calls, no texts, no holiday cards. I was, in their eyes, the enemy who had stolen their future. The truth was, they had forfeited their place in the family long ago, through years of deceit and selfishness. The silence was a relief. It was the sound of peace, the absence of their toxic, entitled energy from my life. Their absence allowed me to truly grieve for my grandparents, to remember them not as the victims of financial abuse, but as the loving, generous people they were. With the legal threats gone, I focused my energy on bringing the trust to life. My first official act as trustee was to meet with the dean of the local community college to establish the Arthur Bild Scholarship, providing a full ride each year to a promising student entering a trade like carpentry or electrical engineering. The first recipient was a bright young woman who wanted to become a master plumber. At the award ceremony, I shared a story about my grandfather and his belief in the dignity of working with one's hands. It felt like I was giving his legacy a voice.